From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Glynn Tonsor with this week's Cattle Market segment. He'll review last week's cattle price trends, of course, and Glynn looks to the USDA's latest 10-year outlook on the cattle and other competing meat markets. Then K-State's Dustin Pendell and Hannah Shear will go over their just-released analysis of the economics associated with a cattle traceability system featuring individual animal identification. Their study revolved around the Cattle Trace pilot program. And later on this week's 4-H segment, K-State's Beth Hinshaw talks with Jeff Wickman about using the upcoming winter break to work on a variety of 4-H activities. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Thanks for tuning in for another Agriculture Today. We turn once more to a livestock economist out of Kansas State University for this week's cattle market commentary, Research and Extension's Glynn Tonsor, as we'll eventually get to the USDA's latest extended outlook on the meat markets and how that might reflect on the cattle trade on down the road. It was a rather nondescript week this past week in the cattle trades, though, Glynn.
It was. As we were saying before we got started here, it was a quote-unquote boring week by past standards, and we all have to remember that's okay. Sometimes calm is good for markets, and I would say this week, on balance, was calm. Let's just break that down. Do live cattle first. On the board, the December contract closed at just over 120. It was down 50 cents for the week. Cash fed cattle trade, the 5-area price was 119. Nothing necessarily new to speak of at the moment compared to the week before. When we look at feeder cattle, the board January contract 141.80, down less than 50 cents for the week. AMS called cash markets mixed. There's a lot of examples of down 2 or 3 and plus 3. The Kansas call was even more varied. Some weight classes were actually up a full $5, or even a couple of 7/8 if I remember right, and then some down 5. To give 2 specific ones for our listeners, 2 of the bigger lots, 514 head at 533 pounds, traded for 169, and then 636 head, weighing 673, went for 151. So before I go over to the meat market, it's okay that we had a calm market. Sometimes it makes it hard for analysts to, find things to pick at and so forth, but that's okay. There was no new shocks per se in the marketplace this past week would be the main point there, I guess.
But there was some slippage in the boxed beef trade.
There was. So one worrisome thing this past week would be that slippage, but I don't want to overreact to 1 week. We probably need to sit and monitor. But specifically, choice boxed beef was down $7.50 for the week. So we broke below 225 on choice. Select was down just at $3 for the week. It's trading at about 207. So a couple things there is, one, those are pretty strong pullbacks from a week-over-week perspective. And secondly, the choice select spread narrowed a fair amount in that story. Both choice and select cutout values remain above last year, which is a good thing from a signaling of, the world wanting U.S. beef and demand for that. But we need to monitor it, particularly that choice pullback and the potential signal that there's a demand concern on the horizon. I'm not convinced of that yet, but that is a warning flag we need to monitor. The last thing I wanted to note while we're on this topic is most people know, I always say the cow stole Christmas, December 23 was the BSE event. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's as big of a deal as that, but the August 9th fire at the Tyson Holcomb plant has certainly gotten lots of quote-unquote related attention here in 2019, and the Holcomb plant has resumed operations. There's mixed stories about the volume that they're actually operating right now, but I have heard from multiple sources that in January they'll be back to full operation. So we're somewhere between running and full currently, is my understanding. That's a good thing in general, specifically for Kansas markets. We get back to normal Kansas packing capacity and operations. That'll probably help the fed cattle market work closer to normal, whatever normal means in the cattle markets these days.
Very well. Now, you have been utilizing the BeefBasis tool and looking at some outlooks for various calf markets into 2020. And what are those numbers telling you?
Yeah, so I'm bringing this up because this is the time of year I get asked questions about, should I sell my calves after background them for a month or 2 months and so forth. And I think every once in a while it's useful to, remind everybody, use BeefBasis.com for these kind of forward-looking feeder cattle price projections. And secondly, I'm going to use 4 different specific examples because as we walk through calendar year 2020, there's 4 different things we could talk about. One would be backgrounding. So somebody that had, 2019 calves planning to background them and sell them in the middle of January, maybe at 700 pounds. As of Friday's close, the Salina market, which is the one I'm going to quote here for these examples, we're projecting $149 sales price. If you go a little bit further out and we look at a dry lot wintering scenario, so maybe we're putting weight on a little bit slower, those same calves, mid-April, sell at 750 pounds, still $149. That basically reflects the fact that the futures market is pretty flat across the spring contracts. A summer grass scenario, so now we're going to look out to more like Labor Day, or specifically September 15th is the number I used. Maybe selling a 950-pounder coming off grass, projecting 144. That is relevant for somebody that's thinking about buying that April animal, turning it out and putting it on grass. And then finally, for those that are thinking ahead to calves that are going to be born here in a couple months and whether or not they want to take price protection or just in general to project their revenue, selling calves in October, so those calves that are yet to be born, 5.5 weight in Salina in the middle of October, projected 172. That'd be a nudge above this past year. Still probably put us at a roughly break-even return projection for the typical cow-calf producer. So that's a quick rundown of just different spots where feeder cattle, lots of transactions will happen in the Kansas market through 2020. The main point I want to highlight here is use BeefBasis periodically to update those numbers. And there are break-even to some small positive margins that are embedded in those output prices.
And that was the question to ask, whether there are some gains to be had here with those price levels. It would seem that they may be modestly paying propositions.
That's how I would phrase it. Now, of course, it's my job to put the caveats and concerns in here. And the main one I would put, if you just look at the last 4 to 6 weeks, we've had what Farmer's Almanac might call atypical weather. So uncertainty on how the cattle are going to perform, availability of forage, and what you have to pay if you go procure it externally is relevant in every one of those scenarios I just mentioned. Even within our state, there's quite a bit of variation about what's going on. So what I want to highlight really there is BeefBasis.com is very useful for highlighting the revenue piece of those decisions, but keeping your own books and monitoring the cost side is equally important, and those costs can be very localized depending on, I'm highlighting the weather risk, but there's other risks that are local we got to monitor.
Take advantage of that. BeefBasis.com by all means. The USDA has just come out with its early look at what will eventually be a full look ahead, Glynn, to the next 10 years and what might be happening with red meat and poultry production and therefore the subsequent impacts on the respective markets. Tell us about this outlook.
Yeah, so for quick context, every year for maybe 20 years now, USDA's done this. They run, I'm just going to call them lots of complicated models. We'll leave it at that for now, in October. And then they put out initial releases in November or December, and then everything becomes available the following February. That's what you're alluding to. This is on the USDA.gov website for those who want more details. But I'm going to paraphrase a couple of main things that are showing up in the early tables. And first, let's just take per capita volumes of consumption across the main meats. They're expected to peak actually in 2020. So this coming year is projected to be the highest in the upcoming 10 years and higher than it was in 2019, up a full 2 pounds when we talk about total red meat and poultry. And when you break that down, beef is expected to be up 0.5 pound, be just under 58 pounds per person. Pork up almost 0.5 pound again, just at about 52 pounds per person. And chicken up more than a full pound per person, right at about 95 pounds. Now, before I go further, I'll remind folks per capita consumption is basically what we produce at home plus what we import minus what we export. Make an adjustment for cold storage because we vary that month to month, year to year, and then divide that by a growing U.S. population. That's how you get those numbers. So you can have a growing per capita consumption by having larger domestic production, by having bigger imports, or having lower exports. And what's important in this story is we're actually projecting USDA, and I would agree with this, is ongoing domestic production increases. And we're going to increase exports, but not at the same rate. So those two offset to where we have more meat at home is embedded as a common story across all three meats.
And then the other side of this is cattle numbers, looking 10 years ahead. You had an ambitious attempt here, but what does the USDA say?
It is ambitious, and I'm often defending USDA on this because most economists struggle to predict anything 2 minutes from now, much less 10 years from now, but we do our best. The beef cow inventory in 2020 is forecast to be down 120,000 cows. If that occurred, that'd be 31.6 million cows. That is consistent, I would argue, if not just understated a little bit, with the number of cull cow transaction volumes we've had in the last couple months. The cow inventory is expected to kind of trough out in 2022 at 31.2 million. So embedded in that is USDA is projecting a decline in the herd, but not a big decline. So, I mean, if you do the math on that, it's less than 500,000 cows that would be coming down from the peak. We've definitely had times in the past where the herd has come down by more than that. I'm going to highlight I could buy that is we might have plateaued, shrink the herd, but not shrink it a lot. Because from my perspective, I don't see lots of strong negative margins for the cow-calf sector at the moment that is going to squeeze folks and cows out of the industry quicker. The other part of that is, and this is some time ago, but I'll remind our listeners, a PhD student is still here working with me, James Mitchell, and I previously looked at the cattle cycle, and we actually did a radio segment for those that want to go find it. And one of the punchlines on that was the cattle cycles have been getting flatter over time. So we don't grow it as high and we don't shrink it as low over time. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. The cost of getting in and out, we just don't have the same flexibility across ag enterprises we once did and so forth. I think those are real and true. And these USDA forecasts of a small decline, not a large decline, from now till 2022 would be consistent with that. The last thing I'll note here, cattle prices in 2020 across the different weight classes, so calves, fed cattle, and actually they have a backgrounding segment in there as well. Basically, they're forecasting kind of on par with 2019. Some of the numbers you've heard me and LMIC give would be on par, if not a little bit higher. So maybe there's a little bit more optimism by the regular group that's polled here weekly than the USDA forecast. And I already made the other point that's core to why beef consumption is expected to go up. Mainly domestic production is expected to go up more than any other changes. It's going to lead to more beef being here at home.
Well, that's the early look from the USDA. That full report again coming out in February of the new year, but you can look more at that at usda.gov. And as always, Glynn, thanks for coming over.
Thanks for having me on, Eric.
This week's Cattle Market segment featuring Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist, K-State Research and Extension. In a moment, a closer look at cattle traceability economics here on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. You are tuned into Agriculture Today, and our next item of interest ties into the cattle markets, of course, and the cattle industry in total. For there's been a great lot of discussion about cattle traceability, the importance of having a traceability system implemented. The economic component of such a system is what we'll look at today. As we've with us two more agricultural economists from K-State. Dustin Pendell is a livestock economist at the university, and Hannah Shear, a graduate researcher in the Department of Agricultural Economics. They have just authored a study on the implementation and the economic impacts of a traceability program for beef industry stakeholders. This was presented at the Cattle Trace Symposium just a few days back here on the K-State campus. Well, Dustin, will ask you, and it may be intuitive, the answer to this, but what was the motivation behind this analysis that you and Hannah have finished up now?
The motivation for this cattle trace, a traceability, a pilot project starting here in Kansas, although it appears to be growing outside the state. Part of the question that everybody keeps asking them was, well, what's the cost? What's the economic impacts or benefits cost of a cattle trace system? And so that led to Cassie and Brad and the folks over at BCI to come and say, can you help us with looking at the costs and the benefits of this cattle trace project? And
so you and Hannah attached numbers, which we'll get into here. But there is this impetus behind traceability in general, which is driven by not only what's going on here in the U.S., but on the global scale, right?
Right. You take a look around the world, and a number of countries have traceability systems. I mean, Australia, even Brazil, Canada, European Union. We can go on. And a lot of these major exporting and major importing countries have some form of a traceability system, some form of mandatory individual ID system. And so the question always keeps coming up is, well, what are we doing in the U.S.? Could we fall behind because some of these other importing, exporting countries are doing it, and some might be requiring it? And so that's kind of where a lot of these questions keep coming back to.
And the objectives here were twofold. Hannah, let's bring you in because you're the one who did the heavy lifting, if you will, on determining the costs of implementing an ID program, in this case, the cattle trace approach.
Yes, so in order to try to estimate our direct cost of implementing the cattle trace pilot program, we had to take into consideration that we know the beef industry is highly segmented, so we need to estimate the cost based on the segment, so cow-calf, backgrounder, auction houses, feedlot, and our packers. And even within that, we know our producers are extremely diverse in how they approach production. So the costs for tagging were the UHF ultra-high-frequency RFID tags, and then the reading panels were all established by the cattle trace pilot program. So those were the tagging and reading costs that we incorporated into our budgets.
So really it can be said that the costs are confined to the hardware by and large?
Well, more than just the hardware. You've got the tags, and you've got the hardware, the panel readers, but there's a lot of other costs that Hannah included in this analysis too, and that includes the labor. There are instances where shrink can occur, which are costs. There are other costs such as
injury to the animal and the human during the tagging and reading process, a lot of the capital investment costs, such as interest for purchasing the readers, and then just the cost of incorporating the system for our feedlots and for our packers.
And the other side of this, you're looking at, Dustin, the economic impact of the system on livestock and meat producers nationwide.
Correct. And so what Hannah was talking about, I'm going to call the direct cost. So it is the cost to the producers, the tags, the labor, et cetera. We took that information and put that into an economic framework to where we look at the changes in supply and demand along the entire beef supply chain, including imports and export markets. And we also included other additional species, pork, poultry, and lamb, because if the price of beef was to go up for some reason, relatively more expensive to pork, we allow consumers to substitute out of beef into a relatively cheaper protein source. And so we took into account not only her direct costs, but the changes in supply and demand as well. And so that's why if you look at the fact sheet that we're talking about here, economic impacts are going to be larger than just the costs.
Well, then there's more than an ample amount of information that you've generated through this work. And let's get right into the costs as they came together, and you broke this out segment by segment in the industry. Right, Hannah?
Yes. So for our cow-calf producers, the cost of implementing the cattle trace program ranged from $2.84 to $6.06 per head. For our backgrounders, the cost of implementing cattle trace ranged from 40 cents to 83 cents a head. And then for our sale barn or auction houses, the average cost was 14 cents a head, regardless of the size. And then cost of implementing for our feedlots ranged from 33 cents to 55 cents per head. And our packers ranged from 2 to 18 cents per head.
So when you start doing the math here and you look at which sector is carrying the load more than the others in the total industry costs, it actually falls to the cow-calf sector, you say?
Yes. The burden falls to our cow-calf producer about 84% of the total cost of implementing this program.
Which leads to a lot of questions, Dustin, about implementation and whether those costs could be, in some form or fashion, more equitably distributed throughout the industry.
Yeah, and so that was, again, it goes back to the cattle trace system. And the reason 84% of the costs are being incurred at the cow-calf level is because it is assumed that all calves will be tagged before they leave the farm. And so a bulk of your expenses with your tags, the labor associated with it, et cetera, is being incurred there. Whereas once they leave the farm, they need to be read, and that's about it. And so that's reason why those costs are being accrued at the cow-calf level. So the question then becomes, well, could it be more equitable? I'm sure they could probably come up with some cost share between maybe federal and the producer, so some private-public cost share. So that could be a possibility. There are a lot of other benefits that we haven't mentioned that producers could incorporate into their operations, such as, if they're participating in various branded programs, they could use this traceability to help assist with that. Any kind of records that they keep, vaccination, et cetera, they could use this. Potentially could get their carcass data back. That could help for better maybe culling decisions or with their breeding their bulls, et cetera. And so there are a lot of other private benefits that could be captured by the cow-calf producers.
As you look more widely at the economic impacts on the industry, which was your part in this, Dustin, overall the demand impacts on having that traceability system in place speak loudly to all of this.
Yep. And so what we did is we looked at 4 different scenarios, and we could have looked at a whole range of scenarios, but 2 of the scenarios were related to demand. And the questions that we asked were, how much of an increase in domestic demand would be needed such that we could offset, those traceability costs to the beef industry? What it came up with, we need a 1.9% increase in domestic demand such that we could completely offset the cost to the producers in the beef industry. At 1.9%, that fits right in with what we're currently seeing. And so a 1.9%, I think, is feasible, and which would completely offset those costs to the producers in the beef industry.
And then presumably if beef exports were enhanced through a traceability system being in place, well, that would have to help offset those costs as well.
So we also looked at a separate scenario where we said, okay, let's just assume domestic demand is not going to change, and what would the export demand needed such that we could offset those costs? In other words, kind of a break even, if you will, for the producers in the beef industry. And it's a larger percentage, 17.7%, which seems pretty high, but you got to remember we're talking 17% of what we export. And so to put that in terms that we might be able to understand, last year in 2018, we exported 14% of beef to Mexico. We exported 20% of the U.S. beef to South Korea, 28% to Japan. So 17%, that's equivalent to one country. And so in reality, are we going to hit probably 17.7% of increased exports to offset those? Probably not. Are we going to do the 1.9? That's probably more feasible. But in reality, it's probably some mix of the two. And so I personally think that, between domestic demand and export demand, I think both of those are feasible, or some combination of those two are feasible.
Well, the two of you have lent numbers to the question of the economic ramifications of cattle traceability. And Dustin, you've referred to it a couple of times. You've put together a fact sheet on this work summarizing it very nicely that anybody can take a look at right now on the Ag Manager website.
Yep, so we got the fact sheet that you mentioned earlier. We also have the PowerPoint slides from the Cattle Trace Symposium the other day, also posted at agmanager.info. All the recordings from Cattle Trace Symposium are also going to be posted via Cattle Trace's website as well. So there's a lot of information available at various K-State websites.
And important because this topic is of such high interest currently in the cattle industry. And we appreciate the both of you for the work you've done in pulling all of this together and for sharing the highlights of it with us today. Thanks to you, Dustin. Hannah.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks.
Over from the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State, livestock economist Dustin Pendell and graduate researcher Hannah Shear, the co-authors of a new fact sheet entitled Implementation and Economic Impacts of a Traceability Program on Beef Industry Stakeholders. Find that write-up now at agmanager.info. We'll be back in a moment on this Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And next for you, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Bloomberg reports that uncertainty remains about the proposed new U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement and why the original NAFTA is not dead and gone. In fact, the original deal is still in effect, covering most of the $1.25 trillion in annual trade among the three countries. While leaders are working on the USMCA, the administration never actually pulled the U.S. out of NAFTA, Bloomberg says. According to the Bloomberg report, though economists argue over NAFTA's actual impacts, most objective studies have found it did not cause major aggregate job losses in the U.S., but also did not significantly boost U.S. GDP. Bloomberg notes that NAFTA did need updating, although the deal, which was in place since 1994, could not have anticipated e-commerce or digital trading. Now, while the administration says the proposed new agreement is altogether different, many agree that it is quite similar to the original NAFTA. Even fellow Republicans, such as Senate Finance Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley, believe that, quoting Grassley here, 95% of the new deal is the same as NAFTA. Some industries would notice changes, however. For example, automakers would require more vehicle components to be made in North America, with a portion made by workers earning at least an average of $16 per hour. In addition, Canada agreed to allow more imports of U.S. dairy products. As you know, both Canada and Mexico would increase the value of goods that could be imported duty-free. Bloomberg is citing the U.S. International Trade Commission finding that the new deal would boost U.S. trade with Mexico and Canada by about 5% overall, resulting in a 0.35% GDP increase in the sixth year of the agreement. Meantime, U.S. agricultural exports improved to just over $12 billion in the month of October, up from $10 billion in September, and the highest since they were, again, slightly over $12 billion in 2018 November, according to the USDA's latest U.S. agricultural trade data update. More on that from the USDA's Gary Crawford now.
For the last few months, U.S. agricultural exports have been running in the $10 to $11 billion monthly range, but we've got numbers now for October, the first month of the 2020 fiscal year. They show October export value $12 billion, $83 million, so better than September. But USDA trade economist Bart Kenter says October a year ago, exports brought $12 billion, $164 million.
That is a decrease by a little less than 1%.
And during this past October, as far as ag products the U.S. brought in from other countries,
imports were about $10.9 billion, which is an increase of just over 0.1%.
Compared to October a year ago. So basically, trade numbers this October versus last.
Little change.
But from September to October, we're seeing some changes in the commodity mix. Bart Kenter says in October, we sold about $2 billion worth of soybeans.
A 56% increase over September.
Corn jumped 11%. Wheat dropped 8%, cotton 32%. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Also from the USDA report, imports marked the eighth straight month of $10 billion or more, slightly ahead of the year-ago mark. The result is a trade surplus of $1.17 billion, down from the year-ago mark of $1.26 billion, but up from just $220 million in September. October and November tend to be the strongest 2 months for U.S. agricultural exports each fiscal year, while imports have tended to peak in the March to May period. The USDA forecasts fiscal year 2020 ag exports will rise to $139 billion versus the fiscal 19 result of $135.5 billion, while imports are seen at a record $132 billion. That is forecast to leave a trade surplus of $7 billion. One last reminder about that winter forage conference put on by K-State Research and Extension and the Kansas Forage and Grassland Council. It is set for tomorrow at the Sedgwick County Extension Education Center in Wichita, with registration at 8:30 in the morning, the program itself at 9 o'clock. Extending the grazing season using cover crops and crop residues, one of the topics. Also using alfalfa in the cattle industry, an update on Old World Blue Stem, and a producer panel discussing grazing techniques to reduce hay costs. Conference registration at the door, $60 per farm. That includes the noon meal and perks. They will again take those registrations at the door, but please contact either the Sedgwick County Extension or Cherokee County Extension offices today to assist with planning and meal counts. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. Now this week's edition of Tree Tales. Here's K-State forester Jaron Tyndall. Jaron?
It's common knowledge that farmers and ranchers in Kansas have to remove invasive trees periodically. The seed source for the invasive trees can probably be linked to the mature trees and windbreaks and around homesteads, though sometimes there may be a couple of generations of wild trees between. The modern farmer and rancher might wonder in frustration why their forefathers planted trees that now tend to spread like weeds on the landscape, trees like honey locust, Siberian elm, Russian mulberry, Osage orange, and eastern red cedar. I've wondered the same thing, so did a little reading up on the subject. What I've found documented again and again is that most of the early homesteaders in Kansas really wanted to have some trees around. They needed wind protection, shade, fuel, and lumber. The relatively small patches of forest and woodland that were around before settlement were quickly cut over and weren't easy to replace. The settlers needed trees that were easy to establish and fast-growing. In the late 1800s, nobody really knew what to plant. To help the settlers, the Agricultural College and the Horticultural Society conducted plantation and windbreak trials throughout the state and summed up their findings into recommendations for trees that would grow well with a minimum of care. No surprise to us, but they found that locust, mulberry, elm, hedge, and cedar did pretty good and ought to be planted more. 100-plus years later, every bottle of Tordon RTU sold in Kansas suggests that homesteaders took their advice. The following is an 1886 write-up on the merits of Osage orange, our common hedge tree. Quote, "There is no question, or need be none, as to the hardiness of this tree. What tree that grows would stand the treatment this does in the hedgerow? Cut it back 2 or 3 times a year, and you cannot kill it. Treat any other tree as you have treated the Osage orange, and it will very soon die. But give the Osage orange the same treatment you do other trees, and you will have as a result a beautiful and valuable tree. After 2 to 3 years' cultivation, the tops will afford sufficient shade to keep the weeds down and allow the trees to grow. But then this tree is of sufficient value to justify care and attention, and I am fully satisfied that after our Kansas tree growers get to know what value there is in it, and how much more easily it may be grown than other varieties much less valuable, they will not fail to plant the Osage orange." End quote. This has been Jaron Tyndall with the Kansas Forest Service, bringing you another Tree Tale.
Thanks, Jaron. And we'll be back on
Have you ever
Agriculture
thought about
Today.
where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. The winter break for students across Kansas is rapidly approaching. While it'll be nice to have that time to rest and relax, it's also an opportunity for 4-H youth to spend some time working on their various projects. With some advanced planning, Southeast Area 4-H Specialist Beth Hinshaw says that 4-H youth can have the materials they need on hand to work on their projects, either by themselves or with family members who are visiting for the holidays. It's also an opportunity, she says, to complete service work or maybe take a field trip.
Exactly. You know, kids are enrolled in 4-H and they know what projects that they're taking. And so, you know, knowing that we have this great block of out-of-school time and kind of some uninterrupted time, it's a really good time now to be, you know, thinking about how can I use that for my 4-H projects.
Really nice to be focused in on some constructive things that they can do, because sometimes these breaks actually do get a little bit tedious.
Exactly. And you know, depending on the weather, people kind of get cabin fever and it's just like, oh, I need to do something different. Or so, yeah, most definitely. And we want kids to be exploring new things, doing things, and doing constructive things.
These are also family holidays, so there might be a nice mix of family members that you can bounce some ideas off of, or maybe even work on some projects with those folks.
Most definitely. You know, with the holidays, it means that family often is visiting you, or maybe you're visiting family. And so think about those skills that those different family members have. And, you know, maybe it's your opportunity to really practice your pie baking with your grandmother, or, you know, maybe it's your opportunity to work in the wood shop with your uncle, or work on an art project with your favorite aunt. You know, all of that family time is just such a great thing. And then to be able to do something where, you're learning from them or learning together, that just makes it even better.
Sometimes that one-on-one learning is a lot better than something that you can get out of a book.
Oh, most definitely. And you already have a relationship with that person, because they're your family member. And then to be able to share a common interest and learn together, it's win-win.
I guess if you're going to do that, though, you kind of need to know where you are in your project at this point and what you may need going forward.
Yeah, most definitely. And so that's one thing we would say is now is the time to really plan. So, talk with your local extension office about what kind of project materials they suggest. Sometimes the extension office has those in stock, or sometimes that's something that you need to order. It's also the time to kind of map out what it is that you think you do want to learn this next year so that you can use that time productively. A lot of times kids sign up for a project because they know what it is that they want to learn or what they're interested in.
I'm assuming some of the 4-H'ers are working on multiple projects. Would you suggest that they focus in maybe just on one project over the break, or maybe try and work on several?
No, I think that depends on each person, and it depends on the opportunities that the break affords you. If you've got people around to help with several different projects, I think that's great. Or, if it's really an opportunity to just really hammer away at something, I was a knitter when I was in 4-H, and you think about all that time to knit, you could really get something done, in that period of time with the holiday break. And one of the things that we're working on in Kansas 4-H is really looking at learning pathways. And so when we think about projects, we've got hands-on exploration, project-based skill building, and that's what young people are doing. And so when we think about that, we want kids to be able to explore their projects, and so that's all these different hands-on activities and practice. The holiday time might give us an opportunity to take a field trip somewhere or maybe a day trip somewhere, time to work in those curriculum workbooks if that's something that we have. And then I guess the other piece that I think is important is when you have some of that time, that might give you time to actually do some citizenship or service learning in that project as well. So what kind of community service related to that project could be done in that winter break time?
So that would be a good time to try and line some things up now so that you know what you're going to be doing, it because you can't really wait till the last minute on some of this stuff.
No, and what we know is, once January hits and then, spring comes right behind, then just things get so busy. And, to be able to get some things done ahead of time is always great. And then to actually, spend that time, making those plans, making those goals, and then you've got something to work toward.
Always kind of nice to feel like you're maybe working ahead or at least keeping pace so that you don't fall behind, because there is a lot more stress involved when you start to feel panicked when you have to get something done.
Exactly. And we want to teach people to do that, to plan ahead and to pace themselves so that they're not stressed at the end trying to get it all done.
Well, that's really part of the 4-H system, isn't it, is to make you prepared, learn how to handle these projects, how to take these things on, and not only how to plan what you want to do, but then to follow through and to finish with those plans.
Yes, exactly. And aren't those all just great life skills that you just mentioned there? Those are all things that are transferable to the real world.
If people want to start working on some of these projects, is this something that you would suggest they talk to maybe their club leader about so that they know exactly what needs to be done and the steps to get to where they want to get to?
Most definitely. I think club leaders would be good people to talk to. If you have a project leader in your project area, that person would be a good person to talk to as well. And it may be that even a project meeting may happen during that break. So those are good starts, and then your extension office can be a good resource as well.
And, of course, if somebody is interested in 4-H and they want to learn more about it, this would be a nice opportunity for them to do that as well.
Definitely. And, it is during those break times, when parents are looking for things for their kids to do, that's often when people think, I wonder about 4-H. And we would certainly love for them to explore 4-H.
And that can be done through the county office buildings.
That's correct. They'll either go to their local extension office, and certainly you can find information about your local extension office at www.kansas4h.org, and you can go there, and we've got a place where you can find your local office depending on what county you are living in the state.
That's Southeast Area 4-H Specialist Beth Hinshaw. Again, for more information about Kansas 4-H or to find your local extension office, go to kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.